The Knight's Tale, Chivalry and Rivalry. Below the smoking walls of Thebes, 2,000 men grappled, sword to sword and hand to hand. The battle between the forces of King Creon and the troops of Duke Theseus was long, fierce, and bloody. And when it was over, when Creon's army had been put to flight, and the ground was carpeted with fallen knights, Athenian soldiers, searching the battlefield for their own wounded companions, found 2 young knights lying side by side. But as they stepped across the 2 bodies, one stirred and groaned, and opened his eyes. "Arcite, cousin, where are you?" he whispered. His companion was not dead either. Both were carried as prisoners to the tent of Duke Theseus. "Take them to Athens and lock them in the prison tower of my palace," said the Duke. Despite the cold stones and hard floor of their tower-top prison, both Arcite and his cousin Palamon gradually recovered from their wounds. Their devoted friendship made the passing days, weeks, and months bearable, though both grew dreadfully bored. The narrow arrow slit, which let in the only sunlight they ever saw, overlooked the Duke's garden. Each day they would take it in turns to balance on a stool and gaze down at the flowers, and at the gardener pruning the rose trees. One day there was a new visitor to the garden. Palamon was balancing on the stool at the time, and his feet slipped and almost tipped it over. "Oh, Arcite," he exclaimed, "I never realized until this moment why I was born. Now I've seen her. She is the reason. Zeus. She can't be flesh and blood. She must be an angel." "Come down, it's my turn for the stool," said Arcite, and he took Palamon's place. Down in the garden, Duke Theseus's young sister-in-law Emily had come to gather flowers in a wicker basket. She sang as she picked them, and the flowers seemed to turn up their faces towards her, and to faint at the touch of her hand. "Oh, lady, I'll wear your favor until the day I die," said Arcite breathlessly to himself. Palamon pulled the stool away, and they both fell in a heap to the floor. "What? Are you making fun of me, Arcite? It's serious. I'm in love with her." You didn't even think she was human. It's I who love her. You Judas, you cuckoo. Where are your vows of lifelong friendship now? The first chance you get, you stab me in the back, you viper, you thieving magpie." This undignified scene was interrupted by a gaoler who bringing in their one frugal meal of the day. "What's this, puppies?" he said, setting down the tray. "Is the cell getting too small for the 2 of you? Well, I've got news for whichever one of you is Sir Arcite. Sir Arcite has a friend in Athens, it would appear, and this friend has spoken to Duke Theseus and won your freedom. You can leave tomorrow." Arcite stared. Palamon got to his feet. "Cousin," he said, "in all our lives we have never been parted. Is there no message for me, gaoler? Has no one asked for my freedom?" "No, you stay, and you, Sir Arcite, must be out of this land by sunset tomorrow. On pain of death are you forbidden to return." "Leave the country? Leave Athens? But I don't want to go," protested Arcite. "You go instead of me, Palamon. If I'm banished from Athens, I'll never see her again." Perhaps he saw, or perhaps he imagined a smile playing on Palamon's lips. Anyway, the 2 cousins, who all life long had been inseparable, barely spoke during that last night in the tower. Next week, Palamon was still a captive, balancing all day on the stool to watch for Emily. Far away, his cousin sat in his own house, the windows and doors all shut as if it were a prison, for he was pining for Emily. "Which do you think was better off?" mused the knight, thoughtlessly interrupting his own story. "Was it the man in prison or the man in exile?" "Lord love you, have you no spark of wit?" demanded the lady I recognized from the night before by the enormous size of her hat. "If the boy in exile had 1/2 a brain, he'd disguise himself and go back to Athens. If all he can do is sit around and mope, he doesn't deserve the woman." Well, said the knight, rather taken aback by the strength of her feelings. "That's just what happened." Arcite grew a beard, dressed as an Athenian, and took work as a servant in the very house where Emily lived. The thought of seeing her again quite outweighed the threat of death if he was discovered inside Athens. Every day he saw her. Every day he took orders from her lips. Every day he was able to reach out and touch the chair where she had sat, the glass from which she had drunk. He thought he would be happy forever. He was happy for just a week. Then the questions began to creep into his mind. What good is this? How is this better than being a prison? How can a servant speak of love to the sister-in-law of Duke Theseus? So he fell to brooding, to chewing his pillow at night and cursing the hour he was born. Just 2 hours after the gaoler forgot to lock the door of the prison towers, Palamon found himself free, creeping through the Athenian woods, his heart in his mouth, his life in the balance. Now is my only chance, he thought. I'll find the Lady Emily and ravish her away to my own country. A rustling of leaves sent him bolting like a rabbit into the bole of a hollow tree. He squatted down low, despising his thumping heart and despising his fate for bringing an honorable knight to such a pass. The approaching footsteps halted beside the tree, and Palamon held his breath. Surely the Duke's men were not searching for him yet. Peeping through a knothole, he could see a man sitting dejectedly among the spreading roots, throwing pebbles at his own boots. What's the use, he was muttering. I might just as well be rotting in prison with Palamon. You asp! You wolf in sheep's clothing! Palamon flung himself out of the tree and grabbed Arcite by his beard. What are you doing, sneaking back here to prowl around my Emily? Don't you talk about my mistress and lady like that, you convict, you escaped prisoner. I'm an honorable knight, Palamon maintained, despite the hammer blows Arcite was raining on his head. I love Emily far more than you do. Heart's blood, death's too good for you, you traitor to all things honorable. Goat, skunk, rat. As they pranced, grunting through the trees, their arms locked fast round one another, a wolfhound came barking round their legs excitedly. Then there was another, and another, and another, until the clearing was awash with dogs. Into the melee burst a hunting party on horseback, and at its head Duke Theseus himself. Part those men and bring them here. One of them is Emily's serving man. The other looks like one of the Creon's men. He is. He's an escaped convict, Arcite shouted, and he's Arcite, banished on pain of death, called Palamon. You see, cousin, I can play as dirty as you. Theseus laughed in disbelief. Is this the devoted twosome we took prisoner in Thebes? Bosom friends never to be parted? In the name of all that's friendly, what is this quarrel about? Arcite and Palamon wiped their muddy faces and rubbed their bruised eyes. They both together, they said, Her. Emily had come riding into the clearing on a white mare. She wore a blue mantle, and even the hounds fell back whimpering at the sight of her. Arcite sprang to one stirrup, Palamon to the other. Lady, your eye has scorched me like a burning glass. Emily, your name is a millstone crushing my heart. Sweetheart, if I were to live 200... Enough, roared Theseus. What is this competition of compliments? If you're going to compete, at least do it the man's way. Tomorrow I'm holding a joust. Both your lives are forfeit, but I shall spare the man who remains alive when the joust ends. Prepare yourself, for tomorrow you fight in the lists. Not until sundown, when they were billeted in separate tents on the field of combat, did Palamon and Arcite stop quarreling. Outside Arcite's tent, an armorer was sharpening a sword with a stone. It grated and screeched. A chill went through the night, but he called to mind Emily's radiant face and went happily to sleep. Outside Palamon's tent, a squire was sharpening his master's lance with a knife. The shavings fell onto the canopy and made shadows like swarms of spiders. A chill went through Palamon, but he thought of Emily, and how pleased she would be by his chivalrous heroism, and he went to sleep contented. The joust was a circus of color. Knights, caparisoned in mail, heraldic surcoats, and plumes fit for birds of paradise were braised by the blaring of trumpets, whose scarlet oriflammes were embroidered with silvery beasts. Blade by blade, the grass was turfed out in divots by the flying hooves of horses. The pavilions flapped like Chinese kites. By midday, the ladies, tripping back and forth to their seats, had scarlet hems where their gowns had swept the field. In the hottest part of the day, Arcite and Palamon found themselves at opposite ends of the jousting fence. Palamon's lance weighed heavy in the crook of his arm after so many months in prison. The squires blew a shrill fanfare. The horses rattled the bits between their teeth and pranced towards one another. On the first pass, both lances missed their mark, and the two cousins passed shoulder to shoulder, grimacing into one another's face. On the second pass, Palamon saw the point of Arcite's lance bearing squarely for his chest. He flung himself forward along his horse's neck, dropping his own lance. But the oncoming lance tip tore through the back of his tunic, caught in his belt, and lifted him out of the saddle, pitching him to the ground. Arcite's lance was dragged from his grip, but he turned at the head of the lists and came galloping back down the field, swinging his mace. Its iron spikes bruised the air with each whistling circle the mace had made on its chain stock. Palamon, his head uncovered, fell to his knees, but he knew he could not escape the swinging iron. In the grass, his hands brushed the lance that had dragged him from his horse. His fingers closed round its haft, and he was lifting it to protect himself when Arcite, stretching from his saddle to strike the mortal blow, rode straight onto its point. His face cleared of all expression. His horse rode from under him, and he stood for a moment with the lance planted in his chest. The mace dropped from his hand. He spread his fingers across the red of his surcoat. "Cousin," he said, then fell dead on his back, the lance rising like a mast out of his hull. Palamon took off his gauntlets and crawled across the grass to Arcite's side. "Friend," he said, touching his cousin's cheek, "what have we done?" Then the crowds were upon him, praising, congratulating. Duke Theseus was there, and Emily too, though Palamon could not recognize her at first among the other women. They were all quite pretty. Theseus began, "Arcite, my boy." "Palamon, I'm Palamon." "Oh, well, Palamon, my boy, let this be an end to all quarreling. Your rival has died a glorious death in the name of chivalry, and you have fought bravely too. Take Emily's hand and forget every unhappiness. The wedding shall be tomorrow." Hanging back in the shadow of her brother-in-law, Emily said, "Ugh, do I have to? His hair's awfully thin already, and I don't like his mouth." She had a voice like the teeth of a comb clicking. "Nonsense, Emily, he's a very chivalrous knight, even if he is a foreigner. Emily, Arcite, my blessing on you both." "Palamon, I'm Palamon," said the chivalrous knight, while at his feet Arcite raised no argument whatsoever. The knight stopped speaking. The woman in the enormous hat, who I learned was a widow all the way from Bath, had been leaning out of her saddle to catch the knight's words. She was rather deaf, I think. She continued leaning towards him, waiting for more. "Well?" she demanded in a huge West Country voice. "Were they happy?" The knight shook himself. Oh, yes. They both lived happily ever after. Palamon woke to each day happier than the day before." The widow smiled and sat back in her saddle with a thump. "I don't know if he would, under the circumstances," I said. "Under these circumstances," said the knight, waving a hand toward the listening pilgrims, "we had to have a happy ending. Now who's next?" "All the same," said a pebble-headed reeve, snarlingly, "it wasn't a whole heap of laughs, your story." The knight freely admitted it. "I'm afraid I couldn't think of a funny story offhand." "Well, I can," said the reeve. "We seem to be about to hear his story, whether we liked it or not."